Hey, everybody, welcome to the Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast. I'm coming back here this month, kind of excited to be back with everybody because, I always miss out. Miss out when I'm not able to make certain meetings. And, of course, the last podcast episode was all together or down in the South. I was still stuck up here at the big ASDAH meetings, so missed out on that one and missed
Great.
out on the podcast. It's okay. It's okay. I appreciate being able to hear it and see everybody. It was a great episode, so... Anyway, this month we've got a pretty cool guest here that I am excited to talk to because the book that just came out is a pretty great book, but I'm not going to give it all away. Michael, who do we have here with us today?
Well, I'm delighted to introduce David Trim, who's the Director of Archive Statistics and Research at the General Conference of Seventh-Day Adventists, and he is a eminent historian of Seventh-day Adventist history, and he's also comes with a really rich background. Trained as a historian, he comes with a background in military history. Actually, kind of historians have different periods of time. I think you would consider yourself an early modernist, wouldn't you, David?
An early modernist, yes,
Yeah,
original.
so I'm married to an early modernist, so this is becoming more familiar terrain for me. So, and what's really cool is not only is he a great historian and administrator, but I also consider him a wonderful friend. And so I always look forward to opportunities to get together. Something really cool I didn't know about until recently, and I was Googling, and I discovered our guest today, Dr. David Trim, has his own Wikipedia page. And so if you want like the skinny of quite a lengthy list of professional publications, books, and articles ranging from military history to Adventist history. Now, he taught for 10 years at Newbold College and was the Walter Utt Chair in History at Pacific Union College before he took on his current role, I believe, in 2011. So welcome, David, to the Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast.
Thank you. It's very good to be with you. Thank you for having me on.
And we're excited today, specifically for our listeners. We are talking about a new book. I was sitting in spring meetings for the church, and they were announcing this really cool initiative. I kind of knew it was coming down the pipeline, but heard about it a little bit more officially. In fact, David was announcing that as part of this broader initiative of 160 years since the General Conference was organized. We'll hear a little bit more about that. And they passed out copies. And I already had one that I had gone down and was fortunate to have in fact, even get David to sign it. Hearts of Faith, How We Became Seventh-Day Adventists. So anytime we have a new book in Adventist history, we like to highlight that. And so it's a great privilege to be able to talk with you, David, about the book. So, and I want to just kind of begin a little bit. We've interviewed you once before with Dragoslava Soundtrack about the Encyclopedia of Adventism. But for our listeners who might not be as familiar, obviously you've done a lot of work in history, but tell us how you became interested in history and specifically in Adventist history. What makes you what gives you a fire, I should say, to want to write a book like this? Because no book just happens by accident. There's a story behind the story. So tell us your story, David.
Sure. So I've always been interested in history as long as I can remember, since I was a very small child. And since I was around the age of 12, I was especially interested in early modern Britain and Europe. Looking back with hindsight, this may owe something to the fact that there was a period when for Friday night worship, my father would read a chapter from The Great Controversy, which of course has a great deal of history in it, and indeed especially about the history of the post-Reformation era, has a particular significance in that book. And also we had two historical novels when I was growing up, written by Walter C. Utt, who was a long-time professor of history at Pacific Union College, about the Huguenots, early modern French Protestants, a minority living in a Catholic state who faced persecution, went through wars of religion, had a period of official toleration, and then the official toleration was ended, and they suffered great persecution, and many of them apostatized, but many others fled and went all around the world, including to North America. So I think, looking back, those may be some of the roots, but as I say, I've just always been interested in history. And around the age of 12, I read books on the English Civil War and Oliver Cromwell and sort of became hooked. I always had an interest in 20th century military history as well, and that's still my hobby. I read that for fun and relaxation. But professionally, I was more and more drawn to the early modern period. And then when I went as a student to Newbold College in England, my tutor there and mentor, Dr. Harry Leonard, was an historian of the 16th and 17th century. So that really just helped to shape it further. This was the period in which I was most interested, though really I had probably already decided that the 16th and 17th centuries was what particularly interested me. And so the first part of my career, for 15 years, if you include my PhD research time, I was an early modern military and religious historian.
Mm-hmm.
And there was, in the late 90s, when I would tell people that I was an historian of war and religion, people would sort of look at me strangely, as though, how can you combine those two? And then after 9/11, that became people just took for granted that made sense. But at the time I started, it didn't. So my publications up until 2010 were entirely on early modern history, well, some late medieval and early modern history, and a mix, as I say, of military and religious history, sometimes both of them in the same essay or the same book. But then I always had the interest in Adventist history because I'm an Adventist.
Sure.
And so I couldn't not be. I can remember reading George Knight's book about A.T. Jones back in 1988, at the time of the bicentenary of the Minneapolis GC session. And at Newbold, I occasionally was asked to teach Adventist history because, as you know, Michael's done this, in a small college, you end up teaching all kinds of things.
Indeed. And by the way, I just want to interrupt for just a second. Harry Leonard, for our listeners, our last episode was at ASDA, and David, you gave a very nice tribute in remembering him. So I was impressed of what an incredible professor and what an impact he made.
He wasn't at ASDA, but we honored him at ASDA because he passed away last year. That's what I meant.
You honored him at ASDA.
Yes.
And others that have passed away since the last meeting. So.
Yeah, and there were a number of people at ASDA who had also been students of Harry Leonard and who'd been had their lives touched by him. So in 1999, it was the 125th anniversary of J.N. Andrews, and it's strange to me to think that we're on the verge of the 150th anniversary next year. That, where have the years gone?
Mm-hmm.
But that's there you are. They have gone. It's nearly 25 years. And I organized a conference at Newbold to mark the 125th anniversary of Andrews. Now, in order to make it a big conference and have a really major event, we did it. We didn't just look at Andrews and the mission to Europe. We looked at it in the broader context of the history of religious minorities in Europe, and it was called From Persecution to Pluralism. And we actually had nearly 100 scholars come, of whom at least a third were non-Adventists. We had papers on the Waldenses, on the Huguenots, on modern religious minorities in Europe. But we also had papers on Adventists, and 3 volumes of proceedings came out of that. 2 were on early modern Europe, but 1 was on Adventism. So in 2010, I actually had my first publication on Adventist history, a book co-edited with Daniel Heinz, who is just retiring now from Friedensau Adventist University in Germany. So that marked the shift towards becoming an Adventist historian. And in 2010, by coincidence, I was asked to become Director of Archive, Statistics and Research for the General Conference. So that book, which had taken 11 years to come out because there were all kinds of delays with it. those who aren't used to the world of academic publishing will think that's an astonishing long time, but and it probably is, but it's not as rare in the world of academic publishing as people might think. But eventually it came, and so just by chance it came out that year, the same year that I transitioned to my current job from having previously taught at Adventist colleges. And so I thereafter was focused on Adventist history. I've still published on early modern history. Periodically, I've published an article or a book chapter in a scholarly collection of essays. So I haven't abandoned early modern history, but overwhelmingly since 2011, my work has been focused on Adventist history. I think you asked how I came to write the book.
Nudge you in that direction. Like, I mean, tell me the story of the book.
So 2013 was the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Seventh-Day Adventist Church, with the establishment of the General Conference of Seventh-Day Adventists in May 1863. So in 2012, the GC, maybe late 11 or 2012, the GC became aware of this and decided to try to commemorate it. And so I was tasked with a lot of the work of helping to do that commemoration. And so we began to put together resources to put on the website about how the church got united. And so we had a series of short articles on various aspects of early Adventist history. So I had all these that I'd written. And then I also got asked to speak at camp meetings in 2013, including the Wisconsin conference, because it was the 150th anniversary of their conference, as well as of the general conference. And so I had to put together PowerPoint presentations and talks on Adventist history. And so at some point, I forget when, I put all of these together into chronological order and found that I had the makings of a narrative. And so I've worked on that since, off and on, more off than on, up until 2021. But period, and as I got asked to do other camp meetings, for example, one at Minnesota in 2019, where Michael, you were also a speaker.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I would continue to, I would elaborate on it. I would do more. And I realized in 2021 that I had the makings of a short book. I'd always had in mind to turn these into a book, but it was kind of like, what sort of, is this long enough for a book? But in 2019, I published a book with Pacific Press called The Living Sacrifice, the story of missionaries who had given their lives for the church's mission program. And that was only around 30,000 words. And so I realized that I didn't have to wait until I had 50 or 60, much less 100,000 words. I could publish a short book. Mm-hmm. So I pitched it to Pacific Press as a book on how we got from 1844 to 1863. And they were interested. So in late 2021 and early 2022, I set to work and actually smoothed it all out, because of course these were different things, have been composed at different times. So you have to blend them all together. Mm-hmm. You have to fill in the gaps, because inevitably gaps had arisen. Yeah. And I did more research on especially the late 1850s and early 1860s. I'd done quite a lot of research on the mid to late 1850s, how the church began to organize. But I did more on the early 1860s, how you get from the decision to call ourselves Seventh-day Adventists to actually forming a general conference. So that's where Hearts of Faith comes from.
Love it. So is this going to be a series, David? I mean,
you say there is a natural stopping point, but there's so much
you
more.
have The Living Sacrifice, which is probably one of I think it's my favorite thing I've read from you. I haven't read all of your stuff, but I love those mission stories, and it seems like you have the makings of kind of a broader series. I don't know.
Well, actually, I'm working on a book now for the 150th anniversary of the church's missionary program that's next year, because 1874 was when Andrews went to Europe. So 2024 is the 150th anniversary. So I'm literally almost finished a book on Adventist mission to 1915. And it's 1915 because, of course, that's when Ellen White dies, but it's not just a convenient hook on which to hang one's coat, so to speak, it's also the case that Ellen White was crucial in pushing the Seventh-Day Adventist Church to foreign mission. And so there's a focus on Ellen White. So that would make a trilogy, if you like. There's the mission stories from the bottom up, told from the perspective of individuals, and then mission told from the top down, and in between, Hearts of Faith, which explains how we got to the stage of needing to send out missionaries in the first place. So that would be my Adventist history trilogy, Michael.
I love it. I like trilogies.
I'm looking at titles here: Hearts of Faith, Hearts of Service, and a third one of some kind. I mean, you could really blend things together there. Hey, I'm hearing you. The book kind of grows out of this this camp meeting motif. You know, you're working with churches and local groups, and I'm curious because I'm always wanting to get our history out to the wider church audience. What are some of the glaring holes that you have noticed the typical Adventist lay people have in viewing their own church history? Because I hear it, you know, in local settings, but you've had more chances to kind of see the broader landscape. What kind of things do most people just not realize about their church?
I think there's masses of things, actually. I think most Adventists aren't really well versed in their history. They're aware of the broad outlines, you know, 1844, and then the church gets organized. Most wouldn't even know that 1863, that the church was necessarily founded in that year. This year's the 160th anniversary, and the GC is doing a little bit of commemoration of that, but really looking forward more to the 150th anniversary of mission next year. So people are aware of 1844. They know that sometime in the early 1860s we got organized. They know that, I think many would know that J.N. Andrews was the first missionary that got sent out. They know Ellen White dies at some point in the early 20th century. But I think apart from that, there's a lot of holes really in people's historical knowledge. And I think Michael will have found this as well, talking about Adventist history to groups of lay people, whether at camp meetings or just regional days at a local church. People are often fascinated because they don't know their own history. And our history actually is interesting. So,
It really is.
It's easy to get people interested simply by going through things with them. One of the camp meetings I spoke at was the Northern California Conference camp meeting in 2014, and I'm going to boast a little bit here.
That's my home conference, so I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, the Redwood camp meeting.
Mm-hmm. I've been there many years.
Yeah, a great event. And I was in one of a morning speaker, and I started with probably 40 or 50 people in a tent, because Redwood camp meeting, as Greg knows, but not everyone will, really is a camp still. There's almost no permanent structures. Everybody's in tents or in caravans or RVs or, you know, motorhomes and so forth. So I was in a tent, and by the end, it was standing room. There must have been 110, 120 people. And I'm boasting a little bit, but I think a lot of it wasn't to do with me. It was to do with the material, which was just people found fascinating. And I did a talk at Pacific Union College that autumn, and somebody came up to me and said people were still talking about that series. But I think that's because people just didn't know, and so they enjoyed being enlightened about our history.
Yeah. I came to this conference in 2015, actually. So my first camp meeting was the next year, and everybody was still the next camp meeting talking about, oh, we're going to get another speaker like Trim. That was amazing. Nobody had heard of this stuff. It was a well-known and well-discussed topic. So.
Oh, thank you, Greg. I didn't know that. That's nice to hear.
So my question, I'm going to come to this thing, and this is the historiography side of me now as a historian, is there's a lot of books covering early Adventism. 20th century, not so much, but the Millerites, early Adventism. So why this specific book? How do you see this as making a contribution from, those who've gone before what you've written?
That's a great question, Michael. And I think actually there's a lot on the Millerites. There's less on Seventh-day Adventists from around 1845 up to 1863. If you look at the great standard narrative histories, Olson, Spalding, Maxwell, they cover that era, but there's more of a focus actually on Miller, because obviously the Great Disappointment's an incredibly dramatic event, right?
Indeed.
Say it's the moment that everything happens, right?
Or the great anticipation.
Yeah, or the build up to it. It's exciting. This is when our roots are. But those great narrative histories sort of then move forward to once the church is organized and begins to expand. There actually isn't that much on the late 1840s, 1850s, and very early 1860s. So I felt there was a historiographical gap there. I know your audience are all history enthusiasts. That's why they listen, so we can talk in technical terms. I thought there was an historiographical lacuna there.
Bring it on.
And also, even those who have covered it it's often been a focus on Ellen White. So, I can remember as a boy in Sabbath school hearing the story of Ellen and James White crossing the Mississippi on the ice and so forth.
Yes.
So I must have been 7 at the time when my Sabbath school teacher told this dramatic story. So we're kind of familiar with that, and some people would be familiar with Ellen White going up into Wisconsin or Minnesota and finding Andrews and Loughborough and telling them you've got to go back to ministry. But it's like the focus is just on Ellen White. What about the rest of the church? How do we get from October 22, 1844 to May 21, 1863?
Yeah.
So it seemed to me that there actually wasn't much on that. So I decided that was one reason I decided a book on the subject would be worthwhile, just on that. And the other thing is, when Adventists, I think is a serious weakness of Adventist historiography.
Yeah.
It's very much a history of doctrines.
Mm-hmm. Theological history.
It's historical theology, absolutely. Yeah. And in fact, if you even talk to anyone who took an Adventist heritage class at an Adventist college, which is, I don't know if it's required of all Adventist college students. It certainly is of anyone doing a history major or a theology or religion major. And other people might take it. And I've had this experience, almost all of them. It's just a history of doctrines. Yeah. It's not actually a history of the church. It's just a history of how we got to a certain number of doctrines. And normally it ends around 1870 and then has a quick dash forward to 1915 for the death of Ellen White.
Yeah.
So I wanted to tell a story that wasn't just about doctrines. There is a chapter there on how the doctrines develop, but there's more to the story.
I want to interrupt for just a second, because I think for our listeners and thinking about the development of Adventist historiography in different ways, that would probably be, would it be fair to say, like, for example, George Knight, and, I've enjoyed reading his books. You mentioned them before. Would that be like the biggest difference between, say, he's written obviously a lot on Adventist history too, right? So he was more of a historical theologian in his approach, if I'm hearing you right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. Obviously, he has the book on the growth of Adventist organization. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the story that I tell as well. But also, I have a chapter in there that's really social history. What was it like to be an Adventist in the 1850s? Mm-hmm. Often very isolated, having little contact. And so it's trying to tell a more rounded story. There's a chapter on the doctrines, but there's a chapter, or more than one chapter, on organization. But what was it like to be an Adventist? Yeah. So there's something on the lived history, the lived experience of being an Adventist.
And I think this is important because we've had a lot of people that are pastors and theologians that become historians rather than historians that have actual training in history, so that cultural milieu and the social history, those kinds of things are really important aspects of our Adventist story. And there's still even more. I mean, you hint at some of those things, and I've heard you hint also in presentations and conversations we've had, such as economic history, right? And I
Right.
see those little vignettes where I'm like, okay, David, I could see, I know what David's doing here, you know.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the financial history of Adventists, how are we, the image we have is that Adventists, and I haven't written on this, nobody has. I'd love somebody
Yeah, we need it, don't we?
to be inspired.
Yeah.
The image we have of early Adventists is that they're very poor because
Mm-hmm.
we know this story of Ellen White cooking raccoons or whatever it was for James White because that's all they can afford.
Or Bates is getting money in the mail, and yeah.
Right. But I think what we misunderstand is that the leaders were very poor. And I've listened to your podcasts about the response to the podcast that called Adventists a cult. And in one of those episodes, you talk about how James White was very entrepreneurial, but he wasn't necessarily very successful as an entrepreneur.
Not consistently.
No, and of course he's not trying to make the money for himself. When he gets money, he's putting it back into the work. So I think Adventist leaders are very poor.
Yeah.
But we couldn't have sent Andrews to Europe and then other missionaries to Europe as well and sustained them there if there weren't some money in Adventists. So I think the idea that Adventists are all very poor is a fundamental misunderstanding based on the nature of the leaders as opposed to the several thousand members. And my guess would be that actually most Adventists were, today you might call lower middle class. They were property owning farmers, but that meant they were probably farming cash crops, so they had some disposable income.
Right.
One of the fascinating documents we have in the archives, and I've discovered it but never done anything with it, is something from the 1890s where the GC asks all the conferences in North America to send a list of members who are worth over a certain number of $1,000. I forget the sum, unfortunately. And there's the list so that the GC can reach out to them and ask them to support funds. We know that Jotham Aldrich, who was the chair of the founding GC session, was from property and money. We know that John Corliss, one of the first missionaries to Australia and a pioneer in religious liberty work, had money as well. I would suspect that these are less isolated examples than we sometimes think. But it remains guesswork because nobody's worked on that.
Yeah. When you're looking at the history, we've got enough institutions and educational growth in these early decades. Somebody had the money to buy the property for it and build the buildings and, put some things up front to it. So, yeah, it's clearly there. We just don't talk about it as much.
Right. We couldn't have founded the Western Health Reform Institute, which becomes Battle Creek Sanitarium, if there weren't some money involved.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and there's examples. I mean, I found going through testimonies for the church of people like Elon Everts, and there's others that Ellen White clearly is referring to. And you go to the census records and see how much property he had, which is, the main way of measuring wealth in an agrarian culture, right? And clearly, by today's standards, we would probably consider him to be a multimillionaire. I mean, he was fabulously wealthy. So there are those stories, but we haven't done the economic history. And you're right. And so maybe one of our listeners that's listening is an aspiring historian that will, or maybe someone looking for a dissertation topic. That would be fabulous if someone would do that.
And, to Greg's point also about institutions, I think one of the weaknesses of Adventist historiography is that so much of it is biography, with which I would include institutional biography. So it's the story of a life.
Right.
And so, for example, look at Gil Valentine's wonderful book on J.N. Andrews. And it's a superb piece of scholarship. At one point, he uses a manuscript collection of J.N. Andrews's aunt. But he only uses it for the light it sheds on J.N. Andrews, which is fair enough because he's writing a biography. But, there's a diary there. What could that reveal about the lives of early Adventists? We don't know because he's only looked at it for the light it sheds on this one person who is the subject of his biography. And so that's fair enough. You also have the histories of institutions. You don't have so much synthetic history, which is a synthesis across individuals and institutions. And Hearts of Faith is that in a modest way. It's it's a popularization, of my work. It's intended to be read by anyone. So it's at the sort of popular level. So I wouldn't say that it's deep scholarship, but I am proud of it in that it fills this historiographical blank spot, as we've talked about. But also, I think it also is interesting in being a synthesis as opposed to just the study of one individual or one institution.
Yeah, and I want to compliment you, by the way. One of the things that, you can always tell the range and work and scope of someone's work by their sources, their footnotes or endnotes, right? And versus just something very popular if someone's kind of listening to this and not as familiar with. But you want to be able to, obviously can't document every possible little thing, but you want enough that you can see, okay, where is the person getting their ideas? And what I think is one of your great contributions, in addition to having that broad cultural, social milieu and being sensitive and writing that narrative more broadly, I love how you intersperse little bits and details from the archives. I guess this should be no surprise since you're a director of archives, right? But I love on page 35 where you're talking about the Second Advent enthusiasm, right? You're providing some context that one of the challenges was and I'm referring to this on the page before, the excitable extreme fringes of American Christianity, right? So there's this element of the fringe or scandalous that is plaguing both the Millerites and will become and remains kind of problematic, right, for the early Sabbatarians. But I love, and this is the point I'm trying to get to, is, for example, you quote the Journal of John Emerson, who I had never heard of before. And it looks like you found that online, somebody that's now in private hands. You mentioned that in your footnote. And then later on, another manuscript collection I didn't even know you had at the GC archives. And I love that appeal not only to, what various historical sources that people have used, but just going back to the primary sources. And so, David, I just want to compliment you on that, because that just that's one of the things that just made it a really fun and enjoyable read for me.
Oh, great. Thank you very much, Michael. And I will say, it's both, these add some texture, and this is always the case with manuscript sources, which is why as professional historians, we would gravitate towards them over printed sources. For early Adventist history, inevitably one relies a lot on the pages of the Review and Herald, which I have done.
Of course.
But these early manuscripts just add some texture because they're first-hand accounts, and so I was pleased to be able to discover these.
Yeah, the other texture that stood out to me, honestly, was the amount of photographs that you included throughout here. I always love seeing pictures of old folks, especially in our early years.
That is a fun part.
Yeah, the tintypes and you can just see the progress of photography even over the decades as it kind of comes through. But names and people that I don't usually see pictures of, Joseph Frisbee, Otis Nichols. You've got some great stuff in there. And I know for some of our listeners, how they may be wondering how we actually get these pictures. Does the archive usually keep a huge collection, or are we still finding this stuff? How do we get some of these lesser known figures?
So we do have a very large photograph collection at the GC archives, but also the L&G White Estate has a huge photograph collection, and the Center, the Center for Adventist Research at Andrews University. So it's partly the General Conference archives, but most of our photographs are from a little bit later. So for early Adventist photographs, the Ellen White Estate is really a treasure trove, as is the Center for Adventist Research at Andrews.
Nice.
And
so
if people wanted to Google the Adventist Digital Library, more and more of those photographs are being made available on the Adventist Digital Library.
It's one of my favorite spots on the website. Honestly, I always browse.
Can't imagine you going there, Greg.
Photography
the
is always
throes
kind
of dissertation.
School, so.
Yeah, indeed. David, who's your favorite character? Just personal, just throw it out there. Instant response. You've written all these early Adventist pioneers. Is there one you see an affinity to that you really like?
I don't know that I see an affinity to him personally, but I was really drawn to James White.
Okay.
Um,
What makes
and
you excited about James White?
well, partly he has a difficult personality. That's why I don't necessarily say I see an affinity to him.
All right, fair enough. We don't. But
But
I mean, who do you like? I mean, yeah.
James White, I think, is a fascinating person. Can be very difficult to get on with, and later in life becomes even more difficult to get on with by the late 1860s. In the late 1860s, 1870s, the church is in danger of splitting because he and Uriah Smith and J.N. Andrews and a couple of others just can't get on. And one of the major roles of Ellen White actually is that she's the one person who can tell James White when he's being pig-headed or foolish or you need to rein yourself in, because he's such a powerful character, and he has this wonderfully acerbic, sarcastic writing style, which I quote several times in the book. And you just almost laugh out loud reading it, especially if, like me, you appreciate sarcasm. It's sort of a British thing. Maybe not all American readers would. But
That's okay. We'll accept you the way you are.
I love sarcasm.
and I don't quote it in the book, but there is one point actually where somebody writes a letter to the review and says, I think Brother White has been too harsh about this person, and so we know that it can give offense. And yet, in 1860, at what they call a general conference, not in the way we mean it today, but the general conference at which a conference that is general, at which they choose the name Seventh-Day Adventist to be their distinguishing title. The minutes which are in the review, the first, it must have been 10 minutes were spent in procedural jousting backwards and forwards about, what's the correct way to go. And then finally they get to the business, and James White begins and says, Brother Chairman, I hope I may call, and he's talking about Joseph Bates, who's chairing, I hope I may call him brother because Mr. is so cold. And so I myself, I discovered when I had never encountered it, but I discovered it at the GC. People used the term Brother Chairman as opposed to Mr. Chairman. And I love that. And I at first I found it strange, but then I discovered that it where the history was, and that it has this long history. So I often use it myself. And there's an example. James White may have this truculent style and seem not to get on, and yet he can say of Joseph Bates, I want to call you Brother Chairman because Mr. is so cold. And in 1863, of course, he actually, in a sense, is the first person elected GC president, because the minutes actually say he is elected. They don't say he's nominated. They say he's elected, but he refuses to serve. The minutes actually describe how there's some minutes spent while they are with the brethren trying to prevail upon him to serve, and him giving reasons why he shouldn't serve. And of course, the reason is he doesn't want it said that he has spent the last 10 years campaigning for more organization simply so he can become king of this little kingdom.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think there's something really noble about that, and that he actually, you have a period of time in which everybody is trying to persuade him to serve, and he's arguing, no, you can't have me serve. It needs to be somebody else. So there's just something compelling about the character of James White, I think.
He doesn't fit the stereotypes of leadership, hungry power. Yeah, it's just not. He's a different guy than you'd come across personality-wise.
Yes, and if you just read his writing style, you'd think, wow, how difficult he must be to get on with. And as I say, he becomes more so as he gets older and as he suffers strokes, which he does from an early age because he is a massive overworker.
Yeah.
If you look at photographs of him when he dies, he's only in his 60s and he looks as though he's in his 80s.
This is part of the messiness of history, right? The complexity, right? So it's not all good or bad, but we can admire those good aspects of his life and yet acknowledge those challenges, and shortcomings as well. And that's one of the things that gets me really excited about where I see Adventist historiography is I feel like, it's okay to be able to write that kind of history. Here you are working at the General Conference, and you can write a very candid history of the church and do so in a way, but that is also faith affirming. it's not apologetic, but in a way, it's with that nuance and acknowledges that complexity of history.
Mm.
Yeah, the complexity of history is a great point, Michael, and I do think whenever I meet with Adventist historians, there's kind of an assumption that you can't do Adventist history. You either have to you can't do it while working for the church because you're going to end up just doing apologetics, and that Adventist history has to, if it's to be good, has to be harshly critical. And I think it's possible to be truthful and historically accurate and acknowledge failings and shortcomings, and yet at the same time be faith affirming. I don't think those are either or options, that you have to be one or the other. I think it's possible to be both, and I try to do both.
Hmm.
Well, a kind of a happy medium or a via media,
Yeah,
where where you don't have to go to either extreme, and I think this is where some of the most fruitful work is happening in Adventist studies and Adventist historiography right now that I'm really excited about. So I thank you for this contribution. For our listeners, Hearts of Faith: How We Became Seventh-Day Adventists by David Trim, and this is available through Pacific Press, which means that if you have an Adventist book center near you, whatever that may look like, you can purchase it there, of course. I was recently in Southern California last weekend, and people I was hanging out with, they're like, yeah, but we don't have one near us anymore. And so if that is the case, you can buy this book on Amazon. I think it may not do the next day delivery, but you can get it fairly efficiently. And there's also a Kindle version, so it is available electronically.
There is a Kindle version, or you can go to AdventistBookCenter.com. AdventistBookCenter.com is the website Pacific Press sells its books through, but it is available on Amazon, including as a Kindle. So thank you for mentioning that.
That's great. Hey, I always like to have a last question. So David, here's it is. What keeps you up at night as a historian in terms of Adventist historiography? What kind of stuff is just either really on your heart, is a real burden, or you're just you have some nervous energy attached to it?
So that's really the history of the church's mission. And I have talked about an Adventist trilogy, but actually the General Conference Archives has its own book series, the General Conference Archives Monographs. And with two of my colleagues, I co-wrote a history of the church's missionary enterprise that came out in 2021. That's available on Amazon as well. If you go to Amazon and search for my name, that would bring that up. And the book I'm working on at the moment for the 150th anniversary of mission is about mission. But, there's so much more that could be said. Of course, so the trilogy is really a trilogy of books with Pacific Press. Mm-hmm. I've got other books on Adventist history, different aspects. And so indeed, a book that came out October last year is a short overview history of Adventist mission in China.
Well done, I might add. It's a very nice intro. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a brief, but it's an overview, but it gives you the broad contours of Adventist history in a concise format, including a lot of charts that show the statistical development. So I've written quite a lot on Adventist mission, but there's really so much more that could be said. And while a living sacrifice is, as I mentioned earlier, a sort of bottom up recounting, telling from the point of view of the missionaries, there's a whole lot more that could be done with that. And the Encyclopedia of Seventh-Day Adventists, the ESDA, has many of these stories, but there's a need for more synthesis again, rather than just individual biographies, which the encyclopedia has many of, and they're just inspiring and humbling to read. But there's so much more that could be said about Adventist mission as it goes around the world, and so that's what excites me.
I love it. Well, thank you for joining us, David. We've been listening to Dr. David Trim, Director of Archive Statistics and Research at the General Conference of Seventh-Day Adventists. His new book, Hearts of Faith: How We Became Seventh-Day Adventists. If you're listening to this podcast, we encourage you to get a copy of that, read it. You will be delighted. It's a great overview, and thank you for that contribution, David. And so we're just glad to have you on this episode of Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast. Thanks for joining in. And if you love Adventist history, probing and exploring the Adventist past, that's what we're about every month as we seek to better understand our Adventist past. So thanks for listening to another episode of Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast.